is Julianne Levett. Wonderful. And I've certainly met some of you before, some of you even in person, which is always interesting because then you realize, oh my goodness, so-and-so is taller than I thought or shorter than I thought, etc. So I've been the program manager at Bereaved Families of Ottawa since March. Before that, I was in funeral and cemetery services. I'm a lay minister / funeral celebrant, and I've done all kinds of services for all kinds of families, particularly the spiritual or not religious. And it's always been very rewarding to just try and meet people's needs at a challenging time, a time that is so important. You don't want to mess it up on their behalf. And so far, they keep letting me do it again. So I guess things are going all right. Like all of us, I've had some interesting experiences of loss and heartache, both loss by death and the other kinds of losses that one has moving through life. So what I'd like to share with you tonight are some thoughts. I'm calling them the power of presence in grief. And if you feel so moved and would like to make a comment as I'm speaking, please don't hesitate. And Nicole will moderate the chat function. So I'm happy to do this in a conversational manner. So without further ado, I'll begin. So I start out with these words. A long time ago, like all of us, I was a teenager. I grew up in Ottawa, but I left home early for the much more exciting Toronto. So it seemed back in 1984, in any case. So once in Toronto, I became a vegan. I went to an alternative high school. I got involved in theater. I had all kinds of roommates, all kinds of boyfriends. I went from apartment to apartment, and I took a lot of chances without even realizing it. It was a fun time, but it wasn't a stable time or necessarily a healthy time. I grew up an only child with two parents who, like all human beings, had their own blind spots and limitations, as well as their many gifts that they did bestow upon me. My mother, who died 3.5 years ago, had a debilitating bipolar disorder. And my father, being a shy and rather passive gentleman, was overwhelmed by that. And he drank a lot. He drank for all the reasons we drink when we're really stressed and can't handle things. So it was kind of a lonely place as a teenager. I think they found me to be a handful, though, but I just was longing for connection with them. And I thought, isn't it funny how, 2 or 3 people can be in the same house, really wanting the same things and not getting them from one another. So I wanted to tell you about the tabloid-style incident that I was part of, the murder, the stabbings, the elderly upstairs neighbor, all of it in a rooming house in Toronto's West End. The headline went like this: Grifter killed in West End rooming house, 2 stabbed. Julianne Brunet, that was my maiden name, hopelessly naive, who didn't even realize she lived in a rooming house. I didn't even think about how the new guy across the hall had a weird backstory, didn't question his story of working at a remote fishing camp, which was a cover for having just come out of jail. I wanted to tell you all this, or I thought I did. I wanted to tell you. And I thought, like most of my writing, I would just sit down and it would flow out. But instead of flowing, the writing hit a great big rock in the stream of consciousness. And so, because this is about presence, I care about presence, I stopped. I faced the boulder that was interrupting my plans to just dash off this writing piece and get on with my day. Though I didn't want to, I realized that after 32 and a half years talking to a group about what happened and what I did with it, it stirred up a whole mess of sadness and vulnerability, even though I had lived with it for so many years. I've always believed that writing is a process of discovery. And there it was happening again. It's one thing to talk to a friend about the heavy things that happen to us, to hear yourself sharing it, maybe with a new person, and you have these little insights that you hear yourself saying. But speaking in public is a whole other layer of reveal. I won't be able to interact with each one of you to build safety, to know I can talk about it without you becoming freaked out. Like, what kind of knives did he use? Yeah, plural. One of his and one of mine. Where were you stabbed? Okay, in the butt, under my arm, and in my head. I was 19 years old and it was 1988. I was working at the body shop. I had a boyfriend. I was trying to get rid of him. He was not the one, although some people did wonder. I have no real memories of what happened. I have no memory of seeing my neighbor Jim killed in my apartment after somehow he and the assailant got in through the door. I might have even opened the door to say, "Shut the hell up." But somehow they were in my apartment and the door was not busted open. I remember Marjorie's voice, upstairs neighbor, floating down from the stairs, from the third floor. Or do I remember? Or do I imagine it later? And then we were three: Jim, dead, me, stabbed, but apparently walking, as the police officer told me later, and Marjorie, hurt so bad she was in the hospital for 8 weeks. Marjorie, the upstairs neighbor, was the kind of woman who seemed elderly beyond her years. She was slim, bent over, with a round face that was made puffier by medication. Her voice was very tentative, but it could be very insistent. I had tried to befriend her, but I could only listen for months as she talked and talked and talked without taking a breath. She was so starved for attention and companionship. After some months, I was able to get in a sentence or two. Marjorie had been a long-term resident at Queen Street Mental Health Center, which was about a block away from where we lived. She was one of the thousands who had been discharged to community care. Didn't really work out so well for her. That Easter, I had taken the train to Ottawa to spend the weekend with my parents. And there's a family photo from that weekend, me with my mom and our family dog. My mom and I have the same smile. My hair is thick and wavy. It was brown then. Big smile on my face. And then the following week, I was in the hospital and they had shaved my head roughly, choppily. And my hair never quite looked the same again. As I traveled back to Toronto on the Monday, I had a sense of dread that grew with each passing mile. Back in Toronto, Tuesday, April 5th, I was on my way to work at the body shop when the business was still new to Canada. I got on the Queen Street West streetcar with a bottle of purple grape juice. I was into aromatherapy and all things holistic at that time. That morning, I just felt sick. I got off the streetcar and I threw up a river of purple grape juice all over the concrete sidewalk. The juice ran over it and settled at the edge of a concrete building at the edge of a financial district. As soon as someone could relieve me, I went home. I slept in the afternoon. Going out to the bathroom, we saw the new neighbor and his friend, a woman who apparently was hiding out from her erratic boyfriend. And here the memories and the impressions flow in a kind of stream of consciousness between the young person I was, full of hopes and dreams, and me now, the adult woman who's lived decades. And there is still a sense of unreal that clings to all these memories. And I don't talk about it much anymore. But for years, it was my constant companion, both in my psyche and in my body. For years, the pain would flare up in my leg where my sciatica had been cut. More than 25 years later, if the conditions were right, I would limp. I would drag my leg that much longer. The 2 breast cancers I had were inches away from where the stab wound was under my arm. And even as I write this, even as I speak, the pain radiates down my arm still. On Wednesday, April 6th, I woke up in a hospital room with a police escort at the foot of the bed because I was a suspect in my own stabbing and in Jim's murder. He explained what had happened to me, probably with one of the nurses. And what did I do? I started praying. I started praying to be able to forgive the assailant. Oh, please. I had no idea. Are you hearing the naive theme through all of this? I had no idea of the journey I was embarking on. No idea about real forgiveness. No understanding of the raw sorrow I would experience when the veil of shock was finally torn from my eyes, that veil that cocooned me the way it cocoons all of us in early grief, that lets us go through the motions. I had no idea in those early months that this was my initiation into the wilderness of grief. And that grief is always an aspect of harm, of violation, of what we now call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that the thousands of people walking around our cities in bondage to addiction, without homes, are living experiences of grief. Where there is grief, there is sometimes trauma, as in my case and many of yours, but where there is trauma, there is always grief. That's what I came to when I was 20 years old to understand. And a big part of that grief is often anger, bubbling like a volcano. But I wasn't ready to go there for a long time. So consider this my preamble into the power of presence in grief. Like all of us here who have suffered, I have been met with great kindness and genuine desire to support and understand what I've lived through and experienced. And like all of us who have suffered, I have met clueless people. We could fill a whiteboard with the clueless things that people say, wanting to help. The hard part, and again, that you can relate to, is that sometimes those clueless people are right beside us at the kitchen table, or even right beside us in our bed. For some reason, they just can't handle the reality of what we're living with. As I mentioned earlier, my mother lived with treatment-resistant bipolar disorder. But when that phone call came from the police, she could spring into action, and she did. She got on a plane, and she was beside my bed within hours. And to that, I said thank you then, and I say thank you now. But my dad didn't come. Was he afraid, or did he minimize it? I never knew. But not long later, their roles were reversed. After 5 days in the hospital, I went to stay with a friend, and then I realized I got to get out of Toronto. I wasn't prepared to make a future there where I was scared to walk down the street. So after a couple of weeks with a friend, I went back to my parents' house in Toronto. It took me a long time to cry. And when I finally did, I actually felt as though my heart was breaking. My dad, who couldn't or wouldn't come to the hospital, this was his time to shine. He was totally there. 19 years old, 5'8", I crawled into his lap. But my mom, who had hopped on a plane and flown to the hospital, couldn't handle it. I remember her hopping around the wingback chair. She wanted to give me a popsicle. She wanted me to feel better right now. Maybe she was what we call an instrumental griever. She could do things. My dad, he was an intuitive griever. He could just be. And I've come to really treasure that about him since. Before this happened, I had made plans to go and visit a friend in Vancouver that summer, spend a week on the beautiful West Coast, go with him to his brother's wedding. He was a good friend, and I called him after I'd gotten out of the hospital. I told him what happened, and he said, "Have you cried yet?" I said, "No." He said to me, like the good friend, the big brother he was, he said, "Well, you come out here and we'll bawl." Presence. I'll give you some more examples of presence and another doozy of his absence, denial. By the time I was in my late 30s, I was struggling hard. I inherited a little bit about what my mom struggled with. I had 2 kids in elementary school. I was a single parent. And read a book about PTSD from the library, and a cold chill went down my spine. And PTSD is on a continuum. When you have a single incident like I did, it's frankly not as bad as somebody who spent months or years in a theater of war. But not to minimize it, I had my share. I decided, with the help of my family doctor, that I could probably do with seeing a psychiatrist. So I was all wound up. And I went down to the hospital to see the psychiatrist, and I told her about what had happened. And she said to me, "How do you know this happened to you?" Now I get maybe she was trying to diagnose delusions or dementia. How do you know that happened to you? From behind her glasses, behind her desk, behind all her degrees and her hospital position, she said, "How do you know that happened to you?" I mean, there's nothing to say. I got out of there and I never saw her again. If the hospital culture had been trauma informed, then her sorry self would have been disciplined. One of the worst things we can do with anyone suffering is deny it, ignore it, or question it. Well, how bad was it really? Or, she had a good life. She's no longer suffering. Or it could have been worse. Contrast the tone-deaf psychiatrist with the psychologist I had the fortune of seeing at the Ottawa Police Services, part of the Victim Services Department. I still remember her name and what her office was like as we sat together. I can still see her rolling her chair towards me. I told her my story in a very detached voice, as though telling a story about somebody else, about the murder, about my own injuries, about the very frail neighbor who had had her throat slit. And this woman came out from behind her desk and her degrees and her position, and she cried. She cried when I couldn't cry. She felt for me when I couldn't feel for myself. She grieved for me before I could even begin to name all those losses. She told me I didn't need to forgive. I didn't need to spiritualize. I didn't need to reach out to the offender. I didn't need to fix it. That I could be outraged because it was wrong. Well, it took about 4 years. 4 years of trying to put pink paint on it. But when it came like a clean rush, like a kind of a Pentecost, like a strong breeze swinging a door wide open. It came in a righteous anger that said what happened was wrong. It wasn't some past life settling of scores. It wasn't karma. It was random violence by somebody high on coke, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time in a crappy little apartment above a laundromat where the streetcar ran 24 hours a day and stopped outside my door. I have dreams about that apartment. And oddly, they only started about 5 years ago. And in the dream, I am too scared to go out, but I am too scared to stay. And it is too small to even stand up in. In the world of death care, we often talk about the value of rituals. And I hope that you have had meaningful rituals for those you have lost, or that you are planning them. And you can have as many as you want because they help. The rituals that were touchstones for me were the court dates. There was a voir dire to decide if the evidence obtained by hypnosis was admissible. Because I didn't remember anything, I was hypnotized. Still not sure about the quality of my recollections. Then there was a preliminary hearing. Then there was a trial, followed by a sentencing. Oh, then there was an appeal. The man who murdered and maimed was released. A friend from Toronto called to tell me that she'd seen it in the paper. So much for aftercare from the police or the Crown. As we mark anniversaries and special dates after someone we love has died, so I marked my progress through these court dates. In the first year, I had to be very well dressed. I had to be armored. I went with a friend to Holt Renfrew, and he picked out everything in gray with a collar up to here. But by the last court date, 5 years in, I was more at ease in my skin. I was able to wear Converses and wide purple pants. Didn't have to defend myself quite so much. The whole sorry mess was becoming a part of me. My hair had grown and my scars weren't visible anymore. I had been suspicious of the police, like a good vegan teenage anarchist would be. But my perceptions of them widened and deepened through this. I had 3 good guys working with me on this case. They were good to me, at least. One in particular took me to visit Marjorie, now in a city-run residence in the Parkdale neighborhood. And he was like a big brother. They were in court with me when my parents weren't. thinking about how I could thank them, I realized I could write a letter to their boss. So I did. Everything that we live through leaves marks, mostly invisible. Through this and all the other times I've fallen on my face and felt like my heart was almost going to burst, I've come to think that our lives are really like a tapestry, full of threads that represent everything we've experienced and lived through. And if we neglect our grief, if it's not witnessed by those around us who can care, who can listen, who can witness us, these threads are just dull. They recede into the background. But if we can give them the attention that they deserve, they take on a bit of color and they become burnished, like maybe a little bit of copper wire. And they gleam just a little when they reflect the light that our lives surely are and become again and again throughout this journey. Thank you.